some work with ILCOR. Previously a paid consultant with the American Heart Association, a number of grants, but nothing specific to this presentation here today. So, epinephrine and cardiac arrest. I'm not sure how many people are actually familiar with this study by Ian Jacobs. And this is the conclusion of a prospective randomized trial of epinephrine versus placebo. And what he concluded was that patients receiving adrenaline or epinephrine during cardiac arrest had no statistically significant improvement in the primary outcome of survival to hospital discharge, although there was a significantly improved likelihood of return of spontaneous circulation. At a show of hands, how many people have seen this study, aware of this study? Okay? Yeah. So when you look at this conclusion, you say, well, there's no significant improvement in outcome. Why are we continuing to give epinephrine? This is a randomized trial, placebo-controlled. Well, the devil's a little bit in the details. Now, I recognize that you can't see up top here, so I've had the details of the study down here. But we'll pause for a second. When the authors were constructing the study, as you would do with any study, they have to power the study. And at that time, they estimated that the out-of-hospital mortality rate was around, we'll say about 4%. And they estimated that that was with epinephrine, because that was the standard. And if they took epinephrine out, they figured, well, perhaps if it is effective, there would be about a 30-some% drop in survival to out-of-hospital discharge. So from 4%, maybe to about 2.5% or so. So they were the statisticians, well, how many patients do we need to show statistical significance from a 4% to a 2.5% drop? And the answer was 5,000 patients. So 5,000 patients. Now, does anybody in the room, and I know we're doing placebo-controlled trials, does anybody have concern with placebo in a trial with epinephrine? I know there's controversy and some people do. Well, they did over there in Australia, so they had trouble completing their trial, getting to full enrollments. So instead of 5,000 patients, they enrolled 500. Okay? So 10% less. So in that context, now let's look at the data. So their pre-hospital return of spontaneous circulation rates were 8% in the placebo group and 24% in the epinephrine group. So 3 times the amount of return of spontaneous circulation and a doubling of hospital admission. Now here's the key to the study. The hospital discharge in the epinephrine group was 4%. That was roughly what they actually predicted. Now watch this. The placebo discharge was 2%. That's actually better than they anticipated going into the study. However, because they only enrolled 500 patients, they were woefully underpowered and there was no statistical significance. As an intellectual exercise, I actually assumed every single patient in the one group died, and still it's not statistically significant. They just didn't have enough total survivors to analyze this data. So what I think a better conclusion would have been epinephrine increases return of spontaneous circulation, epinephrine increases hospital admission. We were underpowered to detect a difference in survival, and larger studies would perhaps be needed to show that. So that would, I think, been a better conclusion. Now, there is a couple other interesting things that I took from this study. This is a breakdown of patients into shockable and non-shockable rhythms. And in both shockable and non-shockable rhythms, the same patterns were seen with increased return of spontaneous circulation, of course not powered toward hospital discharge. But when you look at non-shockable rhythms, and I think it's important, and we're going to see some data in this in the upcoming slides, I think that it's important not to think of cardiac arrest and epinephrine as a zero-sum game, one-size-fits-all. Because when patients present in a shockable rhythm, what's your imperative? To shock them. When they're in PEA or asystole, there are limited options. If you don't have an easily reversible cause, your options include, I don't know, maybe kicking the bed a little bit harder, I'm not sure. But there's not too many options besides good CPR and an easily reversible cause for PA asystole. So I was most curious about what would the differences be in PEA asystole. And if you look over on this side, this is the return of spontaneous circulation rates in placebo versus adrenaline in the non-shockable rhythms. This treatment effect, from my perspective, is enormous. You almost never, in a clinical trial, see a treatment effect this large. So there's a differential, very large treatment effect of epinephrine and return of spontaneous circulation in patients receiving epinephrine versus placebo in PEA or systole. And we'll hold that thought, we'll come back to that in a few minutes. Now, while this study was going on, or circa around, this study was published, I should say, there was another large analysis that was published entitled Pre-Hospital Epinephrine Use and Survival Among Patients with Out-of-Hospital Cardiac Arrest. Okay? And this was another big study published in JAMA. How many people are familiar with this study? Okay? And in this study, they actually found large analysis of this is retrospective observational data from the Japanese database, which is an enormous and very impressive database of out-of-hospital arrest from Japan. And what they found is that in unadjusted, this is the favors epinephrine on this side here, it's not coming across. And on the far side is favors pre-hospital epinephrine. And you can see in the unadjusted analysis, it actually favored epinephrine. But in the adjusted analysis that they did, there was an improvement in survival. There was a long-term survival and neurologically intact survival was better in the group that did not receive epinephrine. Did not receive epinephrine. So the authors concluded among patients with pre-hospital arrest in Japan, use of pre-hospital epinephrine was associated with an increased chance of return of spontaneous circulation, but a decreased chance of survival and good neurologic outcome 1 month after the event. So this was published in JAMA and looked upon as a kind of a wake-up call that maybe we're seeing this return of spontaneous circulation, but we're not getting this long-term neurologic outcome. Now, when you go back to the actual randomized trial, that's actually not consistent because we were seeing trends in the right direction, not in the wrong direction, and this is significantly in the wrong direction. Now, what was interesting is that, and there were some concerns with doing any kind of, I think, pre-hospital epinephrine study. One of the problems is that once you reach a hospital, you lose control of that patient. So if you're 3 minutes away from the hospital versus 10 minutes away from the hospital, and you can continue care in the hospital, which happens in Japan, you actually lose knowledge of what's going on in terms of epinephrine. So someone could have received epinephrine in the group that was classified as no epinephrine. So that, I think, is one overarching problem in these pre-hospital studies. But a second problem is the accounting for time. We'll get to that in a moment. So let's see. This is now a study, epinephrine, pre-hospital administration of adrenaline by emergency medical services in patients out of hospital cardiac arrest in Japan. A propensity-matched retrospective cohort study. Now in this study, what they did is they looked at that large database from Japan, and you can see the adjusted analysis here showing that there was an overall survival benefit and overall neurologically intact survival benefit of pre-hospital epinephrine. And they concluded that pre-hospital administration of adrenaline improves long-term outcome of patients in cardiac arrest. Now what's the problem with this? Here, this is a little secret. This is the same data set. Same data set, evaluated by a different group of authors. So what was the difference? And the difference was that they did a time-dependent propensity score analysis, and they used risk set matching. And what does that mean? Well, I'll give a brief overview here, and in the time allotted, I can't really discuss complete all the details, but if you don't risk set match and don't account for time, what you do is you create a problem with survival bias. And if you look at, this is an example. This is a patient who has returned spontaneous circulation with defibrillation at 3 minutes and doesn't receive epinephrine. Well, immediately, once at that 3-minute mark, that patient is now considered a no epinephrine group. They may never have been at risk for receiving epinephrine. Likewise, there's a major difference between someone who receives their first dose of epinephrine at 15 minutes. They become immortal for 15 minutes before they receive that dose of epinephrine. So you have problems on both sides of the equation. And risk set matching allows you to actually do propensity-based matching, accounting for time, and matching people at that time point who are at risk for receiving epinephrine, meaning that they include people who will receive it later and anyone who's not received epinephrine. So doing propensity-based matching with time, they actually drew different results. And our findings contradict the harmful long-term effects of adrenaline in the previous observational studies, including the recent study that used the same database. Now, I think this is profound for resuscitation research because we need to consider time when we're looking at data from observational studies. Now, I want to go back to that concept of PEA versus systole. Again, I see there's a much big difference, and I was curious and wanted to look at this concept. How can you look at this concept without having knowledge of the large randomized trial that's currently underway? Well, what we decided to do is look in the Get With The Guidelines database, which is a large in-hospital database in the United States of patients who have cardiac arrest. The nice thing about an in-hospital database is you remove all of those problems from the pre-hospital world of not knowing what happens. We knew what happened. You also get patients very quickly because responding teams get to the patients very quickly. And in this study published in the British Medical Journal, what we did is we ultimately looked at a population of 25,000 patients who had PEA or a systole. So there's no VFib or VT. We don't have that confounder in there. And just patients who received epinephrine. So in this database, we saw that people who received epinephrine in the first 3 minutes had a better discharge survival than those 4 to 6 minutes, 7 to 9 minutes, and then greater than 9 minutes. We saw similar patterns with return of spontaneous circulation and discharge to neurologically intact survival. So earlier epinephrine associated with better outcome. We found similar findings. This is published in JAMA in the pediatric population. Again, earlier epinephrine in PEA systole was associated with better overall outcome. Again, this is observational data. We did our best to control for all the different confounders, and these are just in patients with PEA systole. So it has all the lumps and bumps of that. Now, after this, the American Heart Association was talking about giving epinephrine early in PEA systole. I was, going around my hospital making sure people, if you're in PEA systole and you don't have an immediately reversible cause, make sure you give epinephrine early. Make sure you give epinephrine early. Now, here was the danger. I actually said it so much that people actually listened, but they forgot one key thing. This little preposition here. Due to an initially non-shockable rhythm. So what I started noticing in our hospital is patients are in VFib or VT, and guess what they got quickly? Epinephrine. What's the first thing you want to do in VFib or VT? Be shock the patient. And the actual guidelines in the American Heart, and I know they're different slightly in Europe and other areas, is to actually shock a patient twice before going to epinephrine. In Europe, I believe it's 3 times. How many people shock a patient and then, give a quick dose of epinephrine before the second shock? How many people have ever done that? Come on, confess, right? Yeah, I've done it. So I started asking myself, well, maybe that's not so wrong. How many people, I noticed about 50% of people in our hospital were doing that. Well, so we then went back to the Get With The Guidelines and we asked the same question. In that first 2-minute time interval, after that first shock, how many patients are actually receiving epinephrine? And the answer was 50%. 50%. But we asked a further question. Just because 50% are doing that against the guidelines, maybe that 50% are right. Never know. I've done it occasionally myself. So again, this time we did an analysis. We used the time-based, propensity-based analysis. Looked at early, this is very early administration of epinephrine, outside the guidelines. So you give a shock and you give epinephrine right away. And what we found was 50% of people are doing this, and now we saw favors no epinephrine, decreased return of spontaneous circulation, decreased survival, decreased good neurologic outcome. And if this data is true, you can kind of physiologically imagine how this could be the case. In fact, we had a patient come into the emergency department within the last couple months. A 55-year-old presented with chest pain, 12-lead EKG, was non-diagnostic, waiting for biomarkers, and had a sudden V-fib arrest. So they went and they shocked the patient, and they had a big bolus of 1 milligram of epinephrine they were about to give the patient. They shocked them again. They got return of spontaneous circulation. They repeated the 12-lead EKG. There was an ST elevation MI. They went to the cath lab, and there was a complete LAD occlusion. Had a big MI. Patient went home 2 days later. Now imagine that particular patient in the midst of a big MI getting a milligram of epinephrine. So epinephrine in that particular case may not have been the best choice for that particular patient. So I'm going to skip into time in these last two cases. In conclusion, I would look at the controversy as epinephrine is not proven and may be harmful or counterproductive. The current guidelines suggest PEA systole early and every 3 to 5 minutes. VFib and VT after the second defibrillation in the United States, third defibrillation in Europe. And I think that while the data is evolving, and we look forward to seeing the results of the randomized trial that's being done right now. But at the moment, I think probably it depends. Timing, context, the rhythm, as we showed, is a key differential. And alternative options of arrest may all factor in. And this doesn't even dive into the consideration that dosage still remains unknown. However, based on the data that we have at this time, I still don't think that anybody should die without receiving epinephrine. Thank you.
We've got some time for questions.